Thank you for being with us. We've got Kyle Jensen with us from Arizona State University, and I'm going to turn it over to Kyle in a minute for a few minutes. And Kyle, feel free to sort of introduce yourself. Let me give you the origin story of where this is coming from. To introduce myself, I'm Jeff Grabill. I'm the Deputy Vice Chancellor for Student Education here at the University of Leeds in the UK. I've spent most of my career in the US, most of it at Michigan State University, where once upon a time I spent all of my time teaching writing and loved it. Ran a research center focused on digital communication technologies, and my colleagues and I, ages ago, longer ago than I would like to think, wrote a little thought piece about what we thought was coming in the future with regard to technologies in writing, and our answer was robots. And particularly motivated by my colleague Bill Hart Davidson, may he rest in peace. The notion that robots would write was a fairly obvious thing and something that we were thinking about a great deal at the research center that we ran together. But it was a non-obvious argument to many of our colleagues. They thought we were crazy. But Bill's case example that he loved so much was when you go to the grocery store and you get a set of coupons or vouchers based on your shopping preferences, that's a machine writing to you. And those kinds of texts amused Bill a great deal. But the world has moved on significantly since then. And so in my role as a Deputy Vice Chancellor responsible for the educational provision of an entire university, where the impacts of artificial intelligence are significant, and certainly in my role as a co-developer, co-inventor, and founder of a company that has a writing technology, Eli Review, which focuses on feedback and revision in writing. This is something that we think about a lot. And we wanted to use this opportunity to get people together, particularly those interested in writing, but people who have broader interests as well, to have a conversation today with Kyle and next week with two other colleagues about what they're doing. I think we've assembled some really interesting people, I think at the edge of research and practice around artificial intelligence and writing. And so this is an opportunity to get some colleagues together to have a conversation. So this will be pretty informal and field as many questions as we can possibly field. So the way we'll proceed, because I'm going to stop talking, is we'll turn it over to Kyle for a little bit to walk us through how he's thinking about artificial intelligence in his own work, and also a little bit, I'm sure, about how Arizona State is enabling experimentation with artificial intelligences, particularly with regard to instruction. Then we'll monitor the Q&A in particular. And so as you have questions, go ahead and put them in the Q&A, and I'll manage that Q&A, and we'll get questions from the audience for you, Kyle, to balance out the hour. So maybe we spend 20, 30 minutes with me and you, and then I'll give you a break from me, and we can work with questions from other people. Does that sound okay, Kyle?
Yeah, that sounds like a great plan.
All
Absolutely.
right, then I am going to stop talking and go ahead, turn the floor over to you. Introduce yourself a little bit.
Yeah,
We do have an international audience here, and walk us through your initial thoughts. That would be wonderful.
absolutely. So my name is Kyle Jensen, and I'm the Director of Writing Programs at Arizona State University, which, if it's not the largest writing program in the US, it's probably right near the top. We serve a little bit north of 23,000 students annually. So it's a big job. We have around, graduate students included, about 170, 180 faculty teaching first-year writing courses, and all the way up through upper division courses. It's a big university and it's a big system, and it's a really fun job. We get to do a lot of really exciting things. I'm also a professor in the English department. I specialize in modern rhetorical theory and histories of writing technologies in particular. So Jeff, when you were talking about, the thought piece that we're going to be anticipating robots that write, one of my favorite pastimes is to kind of go into the scholarly archives and find researchers at the turn of the 19th, 20th century who are anticipating similar things and trying to furnish conceptual frameworks for helping us negotiate that. One of my favorites is Frederick Myers, who was a polymath Cambridge professor who invented the term telepathy. So he's really fun to write about how human consciousness and automaticity in particular relate to generative AI technologies. So I like to frame generative AI in terms of the larger human preoccupation with automation. So I think that's a cool thing. One of the things that I'm going to do today is just to talk through for no less than 10 minutes the two components of my title. So AI at ASU. I want to talk a little bit about what we're up to, and then what it means to help students to become curious about generative AI. So I've got a small presentation here that I'll share with you. We'll get that going and then start the slideshow. So here's the opening slide, AI at ASU, helping students become curious about generative AI. So you've probably heard about AI and ASU through our brand new collaboration with OpenAI. We were the first university to develop such a partnership with a major AI company. And we have developed that partnership over the course of roughly, I would say, probably 18 months, 16 to 18 months or so, with greater levels of access increasing for faculty and students as time passes. This past spring, OpenAI released a academic version of ChatGPT, which is not quite as powerful as their most recent version that they've released, but it's still very helpful. And we're now in the process of increasing access to students as well, so that we can begin to actively incorporate generative AI into the classroom. Now, as with most things with ASU, we made news, national news. And so there was an Axios report that I learned about after it was published that asserted that ASU plans to use ChatGPT to build personalized AI tutors and offer writing help to students in one of its largest classes, freshman composition. I learned about this when a number of my colleagues from across the country basically sent me WTF emails like, "What's going on, Kyle? What are you doing?" I didn't know about this Axios report. I work really closely with the Enterprise Technology Office, and I sent them a note and said, "Hey, if you can fill me in on what's happening here, I'd appreciate it." The Axios report was actually a misquote. I got an interview transcript because our deputy CIO is a good friend of mine. He's like, "I want you to know that we did not say this." Essentially, what had happened was our chief information officer, Lev Gonek, was saying our first year composition program is deliberately and consciously incorporating generative AI applications into the classroom in order to study its impact on teachers and students. But this is how it got spun. And then it took on a life of its own. There was a quote, an essay that was published in the Chronicle. Maybe it's not the Chronicle of Higher Education, Inside Higher Ed, one of those two. ASU announces a plan to give up on education, and John Warner described us as the Death Star, which is why I have this reference point here. One of ASU's most persistent goals in terms of innovation seems to be to reduce or eliminate the cost of human labor as it relates to teaching of general education courses such as first-year writing. So, as the director of writing programs who plays a fundamental role in the labor practices associated with this major program, let me be unequivocal about this. We are not developing bots to teach writing at ASU. It's never been a part of the conversation. And one of our most persistent goals in terms of innovation is not to reduce or eliminate the cost of human labor. In fact, it's been just the opposite. So what has actually been happening? I selected this background image for this slide because I think it conveys the idea of infrastructure. That's something that ASU has been really preoccupied with developing, and our program in particular has been preoccupied with developing. And that infrastructure is based on, in my view, the concept of curiosity. So why curiosity? Well, one of the reasons why is that generative AI is a fundamentally new technology. I have a colleague that I work really closely with. Her name is Amy, and she's incredibly smart. She helps me with a number of the AI-based initiatives that we run through ASU writing programs. And earlier this week, she had a number of questions about how to implement new practices through grant-funded work that's happening in our program. So one of the infrastructural things that we've done is allocate funding to support teachers who want to experiment with AI in the classroom. And she said she was asking about how these applications collect student input. And is that safe? And is it concerning? And she described generative AI as a database. And for good reason, a lot of the technologies that we interact with on a fundamental level are database driven. They're search engines. And what they do is we query them, they send us to the right address, and then we get what we need. Generative AI is not a database. If you can take anything away from me today, it is not a database. It acts like a database. They've designed it like applications are designed like databases, but they don't function like databases. They don't query in the same way that we have grown accustomed to querying with social media technologies and search engines. So we need to be curious about it because we need to understand that if this is a fundamentally new technology, we need new terms, new frameworks to understand how it's working so that we can serve our students effectively and serve our colleagues effectively moving forward. Okay, the second reason why we need to be curious is because there are existing operational tensions. Part of the reason why I include the previous two slides is because they reflect a kind of long-standing concern that when we introduce fundamentally new technologies, they will replace human labor and create major upheavals in terms of how systems operate. They might eliminate jobs. The optimist argument is always, well, it may eliminate jobs, but there will be so many more jobs that will follow when the technology did not exist. Regardless, that doesn't necessarily make our colleagues feel particularly great about their work. And writing teachers, I say this to my colleagues all the time, we know that you don't do this for the money. We know that you do this because you care about making an impact on students at a formative moment in their educational lives. It takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of emotional energy. It takes a lot of perseverance and creativity. And if the underwriting assumption is, well, all of that is going to be eliminated because we have a new technology that does it cheaper, faster, better, that's going to create tension. The way that this tension most commonly manifests is in terms of cheating and academic integrity violations. And we can talk a little bit about how we've managed that at ASU. But basically, my fundamental point here is that existing operational tensions that address generative AI, but are not tied to generative AI, can sometimes steal curiosity in the writing classroom. And so we emphasize curiosity in order to affirm those operational tensions, but then to try and imagine ways to move beyond it. The last thing is that we need to play a role. So one of the fun things about working at ASU is that I regularly interact with companies like Google, Apple. I spent a little over a year consulting for a generative AI company in Tel Aviv. We can talk about that as well. I continue to talk with the engineers at that company and had a meeting earlier this week. And ironically, the thing that I said consistently in our meeting together was, and this is why you need humanists, and this is why you need writing instructors, because we are trained to understand how writing operates at a fundamental level. The tenor of this conversation was, what role should engineers play in structuring how people communicate? And I was giving the example to my colleagues about how the applications themselves tend to siphon and limit the way that we can talk about technologies and talk to one another, and that there needs to be ways of engineering a more expansive and nimble approach to interfacing with the generative AI technologies. But we can't find a seat at the table if our initial step is to exacerbate existing operational tensions. If we're not curious about how the technology works, then we're not going to develop the requisite literacy. If we then say, well, we don't have the literacy, we don't know how to participate, but what we can participate in is, communicating the frustration that we feel about the existence of these technologies, we're never going to play a formative role in how those technologies evolve over time. So we emphasize curiosity because we have an important role to play. And in my view, the best, most persuasive stance that we can adopt in order to get into the conversation and to play a role in it is a curious one. So what have we learned in the process of developing a curious stance toward generative AI at ASU? Well, the first thing is that generative AI literacy matters. And we've spent a lot of time and money and energy investing in the development of AI literacy. If we don't understand the basics of how the technology operates, if we don't understand the history of how we got to the point where generative AI became a ubiquitous technology. If we don't develop a clear sense of the material impacts of generative AI as it spreads throughout the world, then we can't really play a formative role in how generative AI applications are used in education. And more importantly, we can't help our students do the same. So I was meeting with a local school district, and one of the questions they asked me is, you spend a lot of time talking about generative AI literacy. How do we communicate the value of that to our teachers? And I said, well, like most things in education, the stance that teachers hold about a topic or an area of inquiry has a compounding effect. So if they have a rigid orientation toward generative AI and it's primarily oriented towards surveillance, that means that the 20 to 30 kids that are interacting with them on that issue are going to then develop a similar disposition. And those 30 kids are going to interact with other parents, other citizens, and whatever. And so it's going to have a kind of compounding effect. Conversely, if we adopt an curious stance where we develop a really strong sense of generative AI literacy, that has a compounding effect as well. So we want to invest in AI literacy because it's not just a matter for public education. I would argue that it's a form of civic education as well. The second thing that we've learned that I think is really important is we need to think about generative AI as a possibility generator. When people ask me, why do you spend time talking about and thinking about generative AI when it could steal your job? One of the things that I say is that when you develop generative AI literacy, it shows you really quickly how valuable it is as a supplementary tool for writing instruction. One of the things that professional writers know is that good writers make decisions, but in order to make decisions, you have to generate possibilities. That work can be taxing, and the distance from a new writer to a professional writer, you learn and accrue lessons over time that allow you to generate possibilities more easily. But we can help students do that earlier on, and we can take the pressure off ourselves as teachers and prompt applications to say, give me 5 different ways of writing the following paragraph. When we do that, our research has shown that students actually gain a lot of confidence, and they try to differentiate their voice from the application itself without denigrating the application as something that will steal their thunder. Just really quickly, our research has shown that 3 things happen. Number one, they'll read through the possibilities and they'll say, oh, one of these possibilities is what I was trying to say, but I was struggling to figure out how to do it, and it helped me formalize and organize my thoughts more effectively. The second thing that students will say is they'll say, I read through all of the possibilities and all of them were garbage, and it actually gave me more confidence in what I had written originally, and I'm going to proceed accordingly. The most interesting outcome, though, is the third one, and they'll say, well, I read my original sentence or paragraph. I read, the 5 to 10 different possibilities that were generated, and I liked parts of 1, and I liked parts of 3, and I liked parts of 7, but there were still aspects of my original sentence that I wanted to preserve. So I created an amalgam of all 3, and in the process of doing so, saw aspects of my writing that I wouldn't have otherwise noticed had I just, taken it and plugged it right in. So we have plenty of data to show that generative AI is actually a really helpful thought partner and increases the quality of the way that students engage in and think about the work of writing. Okay, last thing, and this is the most important one. We're tending as writing instructors to wring our hands about generative AI as a writing tool, but we really should be thinking about it as a reading tool, as a distant reading tool. One of the things that generative AI technologies have to do in order to generate output is differentiate effectively across multiple texts. And so there are applications that you can import PDFs into from a number of different disciplines, and then you can query it. You can run a semantic search that says, find me every instance where the term entropy shows up. And give me a summarization of what it means by entropy. This is an iteration of the argument above that it's AI as a possibility generator, but you can start to see really quickly if you use the tools in this way. Number one, it can make difficult concepts more accessible. It can show that concepts can be defined in different ways and highlight those differences as they're anchored in specific types of research. And then it gives us an opportunity then to reflect on that in meaningful ways and to develop more precise arguments as we move forward. So I've got another slide to show you, and it's an example of student work, but maybe I'll stop there, Jeff, and we can, unless you want to see the slide, to show how this all kind of coalesces in a first-year writing document. Or we can move on and I can stop my screen share. This is a choose your own adventure.
I want to see the slide.
All right. So there it is. So this is a first-year student. And the assignment here, we actually have students in this specific unit using generative AI as a thought partner. So you can see it referenced over here. There's an application we've used called WordTune that's really great. And this student is describing the specific instructions that we give. So the great thing about WordTune is that it asks the user to generate writing first, and then the application kicks in. So they're running a block of our written analysis through WordTune, asked to make changes and reflect on which changes were made and why. The student finds that WordTune wasn't particularly helpful. And I think that that's a really good conclusion for the students to draw. We've asked them to read articles about how the public arguments about generative AI have worked. So the reference up here, Ian Bogost calls ChatGPT dumb. And I'm ignorant of what an LAI is, or that it's formed, octosyllabic couplets. So we can see here a student that's using this reflective component of the assignment to think and wrestle with their relationship to generative AI, whether it's smart or dumb, how they can relate to the application itself. And then he starts playing and creating possibilities over here on the right-hand side. And in the process of doing it, starts to find his own voice and says, well, this doesn't really sound like me. And in fact, I can make it do some really funny things. It's not just a matter of completing the assignment according to standard. All of a sudden, the student is leveraging the technology to think more expansively about how language works and how technologies facilitate that expansive approach. Hence the reference to Noam Chomsky down here. So these are 2 pages in a basically 10 to 12 page multimodal reflection on the impact of generative AI on the student's writing process. And the place that he ends up is he essentially says, initially what I thought was, I don't want anything to do with this because I'm really concerned that it's going to co-opt my voice and compromise my learning. And then when the final slide is, I got to the point where I got to make decisions about how and what role generative AI applications could play in my writing process, at which point I found it more valuable for the revision component, but I can see how these other applications might be valuable for the invention process. And in the process of doing that, develops a much healthier relationship to the application, and then encourages other people to do the same. So this is a good example of curiosity and how curiosity can play out in a kind of writing assignment that all of us find familiar, regardless of whether or not we're fluent or literate with generative AI.
That's great. Thank you.
So I'll stop sharing now, unless you want me to keep this up, or do you want me to stop sharing?
Now go ahead and stop sharing so that they can see your pretty face. I'm just I'll hide mine. Let me ask you a couple questions to get us started. And for those of you joining us, if you have questions, put them in the Q&A palette, and we'll start to manage that and get to your questions as soon as we can. So I want to talk about humans because, as you correctly noted, we do have a lot of colleagues who are very anxious about their jobs, about some fundamental intellectual and ethical issues about what it means to be human in relationship to human expression. Once upon a time, humans were the only animals that produced writing. Now we have machines that produce writing, so we're not so special anymore. And I think we have some reason to be worried about educational technology companies. So, for example, once upon a time, I went to New York and nearly won a pitch competition for Eli. And a bunch of investors there. Nobody wanted to talk to me. Nobody wanted to talk to me. And so I was like the bride at the altar. I'm just standing there empty-handed. Everybody else has table conversations. This guy calls me over. He's a senior investor at the firm but he also was at Cornell University. He looks at me, he says, "Son," he says, You have no idea. He says they're looking for technologies that require no human intervention. And Eli requires lots of human intervention, right? In fact, we believe in human intervention. And thus has been my experience with the investor community for 15 years, which is a prelude to a question. So given this, what's the durably human element, do you think, for writing and writing instruction, given the affordances of these technologies that I agree with you are compelling and interesting and should be used?
That's a really interesting question, and it's probably one that we could have for the next hour and a half or so.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, I don't, I think a good answer is I don't know. We don't know yet. And um, I I think the reason why is because we're experiencing a technology at its infancy, and we don't know how high it can scale or how far it can go. I mentioned earlier that I had a conversation with one of my friends who's like the VP for LLM development at a major AI company. And one of the things that he talks about pretty consistently is that generative AI, like LLMs, are hitting a limit, like they're hitting a ceiling. They can't apply general knowledge in the way that human beings can. So you can ask it to, write a summary of our conversation here, and it can do a really, really great job at that. But if you asked it, to tie its shoes, let's say,
Mhm.
that's the example he's fond of giving, it that could stall it out. Part of the reason why is because um, these I don't know if you've ever noticed this when you read research on generative AI, but the examples that they give are always games. The
Mhm.
reason why is because you know when a game stops. You know when the outcome has been reached. You know when, if you're playing chess with me, you know when you've beaten me, and it's probably, 5 moves or less. Uh, Human beings and human communication is much more nimble and unpredictable than games. We could sit down at a chessboard, Jeff, you and I, and the board could be in front of us, and we could say, okay, what are the rules of chess? And we could say, well, we're going to do this Harry Potter style, and if I can break, your chess piece, then I win. And I'm just going to hit it over at a generative AI application that'll throw it out of whack, because they're like, why are you, that doesn't make sense in terms of the predictable rules that should be in place in order to reach the outcome that I've been trained to produce. But you and I understand exactly what we're doing if we understand Harry Potter or, general, US game playing aggression. So I guess what I would say is that what human beings understand at a kind of fundamental level, and I'm going to reframe your question here in just a minute to kind of make it a little bit more, even more poignant, I hope. We understand that situations can be changed on a dime. We
Mhm.
don't have to be trained to do that. My daughters, who are 9 and 11, will can invent a game on the fly, and it has no precedent except that it comes out of their own mind and their own kind of creativity. So generative AI has a really difficult time doing that. Um, but I'm going to reframe your question a little bit differently, because the conversations that I've had with engineers, I'm not actually concerned about what the technology can do. I'm more concerned about what engineers think about communication. So
Mhm.
um, I mentioned earlier that say this is why we need to have humanists in the room. Chris Ratcliffe, who's a colleague of mine, and we write regularly about listening. And one of the things that our research is showing is that we tend culturally to talk about listening in terms of a light switch. We'll say, you're either listening or you're not listening. And if you're listening, you're exhibiting these kind of nonverbal traits that suggest as much. You can repeat back, you can look at someone in the eye, you can nod, etc. Everybody's familiar with that. But our research is showing that, in fact, we're always listening. We just might be listening for different things. So misalignments in communication can occur because we're listening for different things, but we don't know that we're doing that. And we can kind of like adjust on the fly, but for the most part, it kind of leads to conflict. And we assert that the other person is not listening because they're not hearing in the way that we want them to hear. That is a very nuanced understanding of how human beings communicate. Engineers don't want anything to do with that because it adds noise to the process of creating output. Um, Now, one of the things that I think is really fun is I was sitting with the same engineer and I asked him, well, if these LLMs improve in quality when they gather more data about what the user wants, then why do so many applications just ask for a one and done output? Like prompt me and I'll give it to you. And he started laughing. He said, to maintain the mystery. And so I said, so this is like a Wizard of Oz situation. And he goes, Kyle, I grew up in Tel Aviv. I don't know what Wizard of Oz is. And so I had to explain it to him. And then when he understood, he's like, yeah, that's a really apt, narrative framework for it. In other words, we're assigning probably more agency to the application than it has. It's smart, it can do predictable things, but it's not all powerful and it's not omnipotent. And, oftentimes the power we assign to it is more grafting motives onto it than otherwise. Engineers are oriented, they want it to seem like the Wizard of Oz. They want it to seem like it can do anything that we imagine it can do. It can't do basic things like um, to my point about listening. Jeff, if I'm having a conversation with you or you go on and have a conversation with someone else, you're going to deduce non-consciously certain kinds of ways of framing the argument to make it more persuasive to me or whomever you talk to later. Generative AI can't do that. It just can't. Like it doesn't have an engineering framework that thinks about communication as adaptation to the specific user.
Yeah.
So I guess maybe I've walked my way into a long way into the answer, which is human beings communicate in a way that's far more nimble,
Mhm.
far more unpredictable, and in that nimbleness and unpredictability, a lot of creativity can emerge. I'm
Right.
not sure. I think personally, I think generative AI will be able to personalize,
Mhm.
but the way that their engineers are currently thinking about personalization, it's not gonna take the color of what I just described a moment
Yeah.
ago.
Now that's really an interesting response, and it suggests a lot of things about assignment and assessment design.
Yeah,
If you want to capture what is distinctively human, you have to design for the moves and things that humans can do. I mean, it's interesting. We'll get to the questions in the palette here. Just so I'll ask one more question. That phrase that we should be more concerned about when engineers think about communication is exactly the conversations Bill and I used to have when we were running the research center, and we were terribly worried about this. Actually, I remain worried about this, and I'm really worried that our field at large hasn't been more interested in this, persistently interested in it for longer than it. So I'm thrilled that you're thinking in that way. In a more sort of neutral sense, Google, once upon a time in a galaxy far, far away, released an email product that was based on sort of understanding how people communicate. And Bill unpacked what the language model was behind it. It was a very primitive language model. He says they got it all wrong. He says this product will fail because they don't understand how people communicate. There are more dystopic versions of that, that we can imagine too. But I think this is a really important, writing people in human assert technology is too important, for us not to be engaged with in a fundamental way. But let me ask a follow-up question, then we'll get to the questions in the palette. I'm going to stay with this durable human, bit and drill a little bit deeper into writing and learning. So I think it's fair to say that there's no learning and writing without revision.
no,
Um,
yeah, that's
that's
right.
that's the delta. That's the change moment. So, how do we, given these technologies, how do we? I'm of course I'm obsessed with feedback and revision. So,
Yeah,
how do we think about high quality, particularly because human beings learn from giving feedback, not
yeah.
just receiving it. So, how do we think about that dynamic? How do we think about learning in writing in this context? I realize it's a huge question too. You don't have, take what
No,
people you want.
it's a really good question, and revision is something that, if you ask me what's the fundamental thing that ties all of your research together, the answer would be revision. I'm very interested in it as well, and I've been thinking about this question quite a lot. So let's reframe the question slightly differently and say, what is it that discourages students from revision, or at least discourages them from engaging in the kind of revision that we value and we know will actually lead to better work. I think it's a kind of like for lack of a better term, a stolen agency.
Mhm.
I learned this lesson really early as a graduate student, where in my desire to want to help students be really successful in their writing, and I write about this in my first book a little bit. The book is called Reimagining Process. If one or two people will read it, then I will know about it, because I think only about 5 people total have read it in its entirety. But
I've sold 13 books in my entire career, so you're well on your way to eclipsing me.
okay, well, that's good. That's an encouragement, I guess. But one of the things that I learned is that when we're engaging in the work of revision, it's really we're engaging in a work of like an engagement of belief, like who's going to believe in the work of writing at any given point. And so, uh, as a teacher, what I was doing is I was believing for students. I would say, here's how you can fix this and make it better. And the students, you know, having been trained in risk management education from the time they were knee high, are like, great, my teacher is telling me what I should do. I'm going to fix it along these lines. And then they're going to correspondingly give me an A. And I think a lot of us have found ourselves in that kind of arrangement. The problem is that that stolen belief doesn't actually help the student develop the type of agency that creates a long-term relationship with writing over time.
Mhm.
And so what I learned to do is to say, okay, I know that it's hard to believe in the work of writing, especially when you're starting out, much in the same way that anytime you start anything, it's like, is this really worth the investment? Because I'm not sure I'm very good at this. And so what I would do is ask them open-ended questions during the revision process and ask them to fill it in. If they wrote, an ungrammatical sentence, I wouldn't say, here's how you can correct this. I would say, you're saying something here that I think is important both to you and to my understanding of what you're trying to accomplish. Can you try again here and help me understand what it is you're trying to accomplish? And in the process of doing that, they write back to me, and then we kind of engage in a feedback model. That's actual feedback, where we're going back and forth and saying, oh, this is what you're trying to accomplish. Okay, have you considered doing this kind of thing? You can hear in my responses the desire for the student to imagine possibilities, and then from those possibilities, make decisions based on what they're trying to accomplish. That's a lot of emotional work to do that, because it's not just a matter of saying, um, I got to get this better because I've got to get a good grade so I can move on to the next thing. It's a matter of saying, like, this is a representation of how I'm thinking about a topic, and that representation needs to evolve as my thinking evolves.
Mhm.
But anybody who's written anything knows that it always looks messier on the page than maybe it feels in your own mind. And you have to kind of grind out sentences in order to get it the way you want it to be. So, what role does generative AI play in that process? I've looked at and worked with plenty of developers who imagine that generative AI can, give the kind of feedback, like just import the rubric. We will read the essay. We will give, certain kinds of feedback based on the rubric, like you're doing it. And it always goes predictably sideways, in part because of what we discussed just a moment ago, that they don't understand how language works. It doesn't, it's not a correlation between, oh, this is what this says, and it therefore means that you need to fix it along these lines. That's not revision. That's, I don't know, algorithmic editing, I guess. And so what writing teachers understand, really good writing teachers understand at a fundamental level, is that revision is mostly about the management of belief and trying to find more ways to create a more expansive approach to what students might believe in. If they believe in themselves, if they believe in the work of writing, if they believe in the value of communicating a knowledge depth in a topic that they care about, they believe in the importance of communicating purpose or defining terms or whatever the case may be. Generative AI can play a supplementary role in that, in the ways that I described initially in my presentation. They can help students break texts apart in ways that might feel, impossible upon first starting. They can help initiate a drafting process. Some applications are really good at invention, less so at reflection or revision. We need to be targeted about that, in my view. But they're not going to take over, at least in the way that they're currently being imagined. Your experience with industry developers is identical to mine.
Yeah.
They are thinking about optimization, and writing the learning of writing is not an optimized process.
Yeah.
There are aspects of it that can be optimized and improved through technology, but taken as a whole, I am not overly sanguine about the possibility of an industry partner doing that work.
That's why there's no venture capital and educational technologies focused on writing. It's hard to optimize.
Yeah,
That notion of algorithmic editing is really interesting to me because, I've taken standard rubrics and run them against writing, and it produces feedback
Mhm.
that is rubric driven and that is about as good as really bad teacher feedback.
Yeah,
But
I
it
think that's a
doesn't.
good description.
Yeah, I think that's okay. So let's get to. We have some questions from the people who are with us today. There's some questions about AI literacy. So let me combine a couple. So
Okay.
if you're interested in learning more about AI, and if you're an English teacher in particular who wants to develop their AI literacy, where do you start?
Thanks for asking that question. That's something that I've been kind of worrying about for the last 2 years or so. As it turns out, I won an NEH grant with a colleague of mine, and it was focused on AI literacy. And what we've started to do is develop AI literacy shorts. So 5-minute videos. I'm talking with expert humanists who have spent a lot of time thinking about generative AI. And what we do is we ask them basic questions like define what generative AI is, where do you think it's headed, et cetera, et cetera. We're publishing the first 2 videos in that series. One is with Ian Bogost, who's a writer for The Atlantic, and he's an exceptional scholar in this domain. He's an incredible teacher. The part of the video that I want everyone to pay attention to, he says the value of writing instruction in the face of AI, I'm summarizing it, is helping students develop domain-specific knowledge
Mhm.
in ways that lead to creativity and creation. If we can think about research as developing domain-specific knowledge in relationship to generative AI applications, I think that that's a really thoughtful approach, and I can talk more about that in a moment. The second video is with a colleague of mine at the University of Waterloo named Marcel O'Gorman, who focuses mostly on the kind of physiological and environmental impacts of material technologies, such as generative AI. So his video is great as well. We're going to be developing those videos more and more over the course of this year. We were kind of doing a test run to see if it works. It works, and they turned out really well. So if you email me, I will send them to you, send a link to you as soon as they're available. But if you're wanting to develop entry point knowledge about generative AI, a really helpful book is called Human Compatible by Stuart Russell. Um, I I have misgivings about certain ways that he presents the technology, and I could talk about that more if you're interested. But generally speaking, it's a really helpful introduction to the history and evolution of these technologies from a leader in the space. And if you want to read like a fictional account of it, then I read The Maniac by Benjamin Labatut. That's a great one too.
Well, sometimes the fictional accounts are the more accurate ones, aren't they?
In this case, it just might be. I mean, there are certain things that are a little bit curious, and I always try to triangulate those kinds of accounts with my engineer friends who are really deep in the weeds with it. There are certain kinds of things that I think he's dramatizing in order to draw into clear relief the potential threat he sees that they pose. But
Mhm.
for the most part, he's a kind of like it would be unfair to call it historical fiction because it's more historical than fiction, but he creates fictional moments that draw the importance of the history into clear relief. And he's just an extraordinary writer.
Okay, excellent. So what's your pitch for inviting faculty buy-in for those, and I know you have this, for those who are hesitant, if not resistant, to the use of AI in the classroom?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So one of the things that I talk a lot about as a director is the importance of data and kind of using data to make arguments for the type of values that organize our work and structure our best practices. So a lot of universities that I've visited over the last year get really excited about collecting data where they're trying to give faculty a space to air their grievances about generative AI. And all they really discover in the process of doing that is a lot of faculty are super pissed about the intrusion of generative AI in their working environment. And in the process of doing that, it doesn't ever really have a counterpoint.
Mhm.
So I emphasize the importance of, if you want to learn about generative AI, here are some resources. We are going to be conducting this research that we would like for you to participate in order to create the data sets that allow us to make persuasive arguments to decision makers about the role that technology will play in our university as a whole. We try to find a diverse range of faculty to do that. So I say really consistently that a successful writing program is not dominated by the voice of one director, but made of many voices with varied experiences. So we try to find faculty who are willing to kind of experiment and then talk about what was good, what was not good, what did we learn, what did our students do, and then we try as much as possible to develop policies that manage the tension points, especially as it relates to academic integrity. I can do that work as a director by working very closely with our college and with our provost office about how to manage that work. And I've tried to take as much off their plate as possible by creating best practices, by bringing in, other faculty to talk about the impact that these technologies are having. But mostly it's about communicating process and inviting people into the process, and then encouraging curiosity in the face of resistance.
Good answer. I'm sure you have some really difficult conversations along the way. Um, so here's a question. So it goes back to your answer to that notion of a durable human element or skill or capacity or value.
Yeah.
So you talked about listening when you talked about that human ability to be adaptive, right? So that's something that's distinctly human in terms of adaptation to specific user, to context, and things like that. So isn't part of the problem with writing that we don't have the immediate feedback from users that we need to make those adaptations? So can AI help us with that? How do you think about the distinction between speech and writing, maybe, in relationship to that kind of adaptation and creativity that is perhaps uniquely human?
Yeah, I think I'm not sure that I agree with the fundamental premise that we struggle to adapt our writing. I think one of the great things about writing is it's a fundamentally iterative and version-based phenomenon that we can consistently adapt in response to feedback and as writing in one situation travels to new contexts. So, the cool thing about, writing is that we can say, well, this was responsive to these particular contingencies, and we're adapting it in this particular way in order to produce these alternative effects. And, we do that through speech. We do that through writing. I mean, I talk with people whose my relationships with them is 90% writing and 10% speech. Can generative AI help with that? Maybe. Not as currently constructed. We have to think about generative AI, like large language models, as kind of self-contained worlds. Like it's a language world. That's what I describe to my colleagues, and it has a timestamp. In order to have to increase in complexity, it has to have operational closure. Now, my colleagues, in the industry are constantly adapting, software overlays to adapt and to help the LLMs adapt in real time. So, like for example, the example I like to give is, most of the LLMs were created before Taylor Swift and Travis Kelce started dating, and if they get, that write a haiku about their love story, it's not going to be as precise unless the LLM can query content that's live. So
Right.
I think as LLMs evolve, you're going to see more real-time adaptations. It's going to give the simulation of like, oh, this is responsive to real-time things. But I have not yet seen applications that are capable of responding specifically to me. It can make it sound like it can do things that make it sound like my voice. It can, you know, it can adjust in response to new prompts and directions and revised instructions, but the kind of it just is not as nimble as maybe what that question is asking.
Okay.
So Will it get there? We'll see. I'm not, again, I'm not overly sanguine about it. But I do think that there are aspects of human communication that um, AI can optimize, expand, streamline, but it's not a one-to-one thing. We've got to stop thinking about this as a zero-sum game. We need to start thinking about it as an additive phenomenon.
Yeah. No, I think that I agree with you on that. But there's a bit of a struggle in some corners of higher education on that question of additive or zero sum. But let me pick up on that notion of voice and talk about homogenization. So we have a question about do you worry, should we worry about not just maybe the homogenization of voice, but the homogenization of ideas, given a persistent use of AI to produce text that gets fed back into those same sorts of machines?
I'm going to answer the question in two ways.
Mhm.
Let's start with AI literacy first. Any guess about how many textual parameters or textual tokens, what they call them tokens or something like that? I have a technical term. Parameters is not the right term, but how many texts go into a large language model? Like how large is a large language model?
They're massive, so no, I don't have a guess.
Yeah, it's 178 billion
Yeah.
for your run-of-the-mill large language model. So if I asked anybody in the room to say, okay, model 178 billion, what would that look like? I think everybody would struggle with that. I mean, like I have examples that I give that I won't bore you with, but I think it's like 1 billion would be like, we put uh, 1 billion oranges would be you fill the Orange Bowl, like the stadium, with a certain amount. Like it would take five of them to fill all the way to capacity to get to a billion, and we've got 178 more of that. So like wrap our heads like that's a lot of complexity. Um, Homogenization, I think no, I don't think so. I think that what we're going to see as we move forward is that the processing power will start to allow for greater levels of complexity. Like it will speed up. It will start to become more aware of the homogeneity of its output. It will start to have new creative overlays that will add greater complexity to the output. So no, I don't think from a just a hardware and software perspective, homogeneity is not something I'm worried about. If you're talking about the homogeneity of ideas, we don't have to talk about AI. We can just talk about social media
Hmm.
uh, as a kind of chief catalyst for that phenomenon. In the conversation that I had earlier this week with my colleague who's an engineer, we talked a little bit about how the frameworks that people are using in communication are being primarily structured by likes and unlikes, or LOLs or fires, or and Catherine Hales talks about this really eloquently in My Mother Was a Computer. She talks about it as intermediation, that the technologies we use will show up in the way that we talk about ourselves. I'll say I don't have the bandwidth for that, like I'm not a network, or I'm not that kind of network. But I'll still use those kinds of technologies to describe my capacity for something. But I don't know if you feel this way, Jeff. I don't know if it's because I'm getting older, but like we're seeing technologies really narrow down
Hmm.
how people conceptualize the complexity of language, and that's playing more of a role than AI will. So I'm more concerned about social media in that regard, and news media in particular, and broader socio-political forces that convince people that the way to get something done is not to be expansive with our language choices, but to be restrictive with them. So that's a different kind of conversation altogether.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. I mean, I'm really old, so I remember a moment in which the intersection between writing and technologies was terribly exciting and very dynamic and exceptionally creative and remarkably open. And then it got really awful and very narrow. One of the reasons why I'm really interested in these generative intelligences is these are different technologies, and I think it'll be interesting to see whether things get more open and more creative and dynamic, which I think is a distinct possibility, or whether they trend towards what's happened with social media, which has been, I think, has turned into something um, not particularly pleasant or creative or remarkable with regard to how we think about writing. It used to be, once upon a time, it was a very dynamic space. And I think my hope is that these intelligences create infinite kinds of possibilities for how we think about communication. But I think there's a lot of water to flow under that bridge before we sort it out.
And I think the important admonition is if we want that to exist, we need to create it.
We got to create it. I know.
We've got
Um,
to create it.
This goes back to the importance of humanists and writing people in particular making technologies,
Yeah.
um, and then using the technologies that we make. And I think that's a big ask of us, but I think that's fundamentally the ask because, as you know, the engineers are going to make them and they're going to optimize because engineers are optimization machines.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. And, I don't think maybe it's stereotypical to say, but they don't seem as interested in language problems. I think they feel language problems, but they're not interested in solving language problems that we're interested in. So yeah, I agree with you. Finding ways to create those collaborations is going to be really key moving forward.
So we have not time enough for two really good questions that just popped up. One that just popped up, which we could have spent an hour on. So
Okay.
I'm gonna have to get it to you in another way. But the question I want to ask you to close is a question that I wrestle with in my role at the University of Leeds. And that is, academics who are trying to sort out assignment design and assessment design. So, how should we frame assignments? And I'll just add assessments more broadly, that will make students not be overly reliant on AI, assuming we're in an environment which we allow them to use them, which at the University of Leeds, we certainly are moving in that direction when we make that possible, not overly reliant or resist the temptation to using AI through and through. So how do we make these things so students use them but don't become dependent or over reliant on them?
Well, I see that question came from Mohammed, who just graduated from our writing program. So, Mohammed,
He
thanks
should
for
know the answer, right?
I'm not doing my job. Actually, Mohammed's so wonderful, and I'm so excited that he's going to be at TCU in a couple of weeks. It looks like starting up. Um, my answer to this question, which is a really smart one, is I focus on history. And I frame the work of assignment development and assignment engagement and assessment primarily in terms of problem solving. So it's one of the steps that students are really inclined to skip when they engage with AI technologies is to say, this is a thing that helps me do something. It's not a subject that I need to consider independent of the thing that I need to do. So as a result, their engagement, that's a very kind of low level literacy. Like I can make the application do what I want it to do. So I'm going to make it do that. If you furnish history and we say, okay, this application has a provenance, it has a history that we need to study. It's gone through multiple versions. We can start to see the engineers as problem solvers. We can say, when did they decide that this was the best, most valuable use of their time? I said, well, they should have done this. I said, well, what if that's like boiling the ocean? They have to produce something. They have to create applications in order to make enough money to operate to create the next thing. What happens is they start to think in terms of situation,
Mhm.
material constraint. They start to think in decision making and possibility. So those are all really key components of assignment design, assignment assess when you're assessing whether or not students are actually developing the kind of thinking habits that are characteristic of higher order literacy. So, Mohammed, you've heard me say this 1,000 times. I think if you've heard me say it once, that we take a problem solving orientation. But to do that, we have to have a really nice historical framework. We have to have a material framework. We have to have a theoretical framework to understand why the problem is the way it is at certain points, how the problem evolves. And I promise you, because I have data to support this, when students do that, their relationship to the application fundamentally changes. They believe that they have a greater level of agency in engaging with the technology. They're much more creative in how they apply it in their assignments, and they get super curious about what's next and how they can play a role in that process. Unfortunately, it just doesn't occur to very many teachers because the uptake is significant. Like this is
Mhm.
the area of research for many people that are like, I didn't even think about generative AI prior to, November 2022. And now I've got to learn that it's this big field and that it has this evolution. And it's like, well, yeah, but that's our job.
That's our
We're
job.
we're
Yeah.
learners. We need to be curious about it.
Yeah. Well, let's end there with one of my favorite, most powerful superpower virtues of curiosity and the notion that we can leverage these technologies and the way in which we engage with students through these technologies to create little curiosity machines is the kind of idea I want to leave this conversation with. So Kyle, thank you so much for spending your precious, valuable time with us. It was really a gift. I enjoyed the conversation. I love the questions we got. We got more questions that we can handle. They're great questions. So thanks to you and thanks to everyone who joined us today. It was a real pleasure to spend some time with you. And I've got some things I'm going to follow up with you on, Kyle. So
Okay.
you're not done with me, unfortunately. You're gonna regret ever saying yes to me. But
I doubt that, but just to everybody who joined, I thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to talk with you. I think the more conversations we can have as a field along these lines, I think the healthier we will be long term. If there's anything that I can do to support you, yes, I have a big job as a director of writing programs, but I believe in the value of mentorship and collegiality and support. So if there's something that I can do for you, I hope you will email me. I saw in some of the comments, where are the videos? I will get you the videos and I'll develop more, I promise. And we'll all work to a great outcome together.
great. Kyle, thank you so much. Thanks everyone for being with us. Enjoy the rest of your morning, afternoon, or evening, wherever you may be. I appreciate it. Thank you now. Bye now.